then that we need to kind of develop an inner voice. Like, and sometimes they talk about this as like, there are different phrases for that. Sometimes they talk about like, there's one phrase in Tibetan Buddhism where they say there's the outer lama or teacher or guru, but then eventually you have to develop an inner guru. Lama Yeshe, he wrote that book, Becoming Your Own Therapist, right, where he says you have to become, he says that, you have to become your own therapist, giving yourself wise advice. And that's part of also what I was saying about, that's part of the practice also of self-compassion, right? So with compassion for yourself, like you face your own difficulties, right, your own pain, your own confusion, whatever. But then you start to recognize, and this is important, that you start to recognize you also have within you parts that aren't in that. Like, I guess my point, I was going to say it this way, actually, it's very fundamental, and actually, again, these are like things that are in Buddhist texts but aren't always talked about in this way, so I'm just going to talk about this real quick. We all have our negative habits, our mental afflictions, our confusions, but that's not all of who we are. That's one way of saying it. It's just a part of us. And if you look actually in Buddhist texts, they use these metaphors often. Like in Shantideva, he uses military metaphors. He was Indian, and so he often uses these military metaphors where he talks about a battle. And basically he's saying like one part of him is sort of very destructive, actually. And then he's saying, but there's another part of him that knows that's destructive, right? So then he says, well, so then these two parts he says they need to have a battle. Actually, some Tibetan masters, when you read them, they're not Indian, right? So a lot of their metaphors are of demons, And that's where, so Tibetan practices if you study a lot of Tibetan practices, they talk about demons a lot, because that was their culture, so like you have to kind of, it depends which practice you're doing. Sometimes they're fighting their demons, other times they're feeding their demons, sometimes they're having compassion for their demons and leading their demons to enlightenment. Padmasambhava, right, turned his demon protectors. Padmasambhava. He was famous in Tibet. He came to Tibet, and because Tibetans were very into demons, actually, as their culture, originally before Buddhism came, there was kind of shamanistic, and there was a sense of that. And they said, so Padmasambhava came in, and his practice was he went to all these places that were known to be like, have powerful forces like that, and he turned them in. They say he turned the demons into protectors of the Dharma. Right? So he transformed the demons in a sense. So there are different ways. There are all these different metaphors, but they're all metaphors in a way. And so I guess my point is like, I think sometimes we have to also work. We have to find our own way of working with that. Right? And so I guess my point is like when this is really what I'm getting at. So let's say you're in a pattern like Lama Tsongkhapa was describing, where you think, oh, I can't do it, or like one is like the low self-esteem or lack of self-confidence, maybe is what I say, right? Oh, I can't accomplish that. Then to recognize that's a part of me. So step one. And there's this line I love in Dharmaraja. He was an Indian master, one of Atisha's teachers. Dharmaraja is full of sharp weapons, mind training. And there's this beautiful description in there where he says, there's this beautiful passage in there, it's very psychological actually, where he says, Dharmaraja says, up towards his own narcissistic, self-centered part, he says, you self-centered butcher, up until now, I thought I was you. He says, but you're not me. You're the cause of all my suffering. And he says, I will never again listen to you. I won't be your slave. I won't let you serve me up to others, chop me up. Like, he's like, you're a butcher, basically, right? And he says, you've been the cause of all my suffering. And the horrible part, essentially, is I thought I was you. And he says, but I'm not you. And then he calls, there's this beautiful passage in this text, then he calls forth Yamantaka, who is like, Manjushri, he's pictured over there, I saw this tanka, he's holding a sword. Yamantaka is an even fiercer version of Manjushri. It's like Manjushri manifests as like, Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom. And sometimes Manjushri manifests as Yamantaka. In this text, it's a red Yamantaka, kind of has a hammer. And he says, Yamantaka, I call you forth. Smash him over the head with your hammer. Beat him to a pulp, essentially. He says, smash him 3 times. It's a beautiful passage in it. But if you take this psychologically or metaphorically, because Dharmaraja didn't literally think there was a demon or a butcher living inside him, right? It was a metaphor, right? And what was he saying? He was recognizing, there was a part of me that I thought was me that's not me.
It's the shadow.
What's that?
The shadow. We all have a shadow.
Yeah, his shadow. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He recognized his shadow and he said, I'm not you.
Mm-hmm.
But then he also recognized in Yamantaka his own potential for wisdom. And he was saying, he was calling forth his own potential for wisdom in one sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying, potential for wisdom, overcome my potential for self-centered ignorance. And destroy it, transform it, transmute it into wisdom. You can, in his case it was destroyed, but there is some words transmute. And I guess my point is it was a beautiful passage of poem. Actually, this was poetic text. But there's also a beautiful text by the first Panchen Lama, Tibetan Lama, beautiful, called A Debate Between Self-Centered Ignorance, essentially, or the reifying self-centered habit, something like that, self-ignorance, ignorance about the self, and wisdom. And it's a very funny poem, actually. He said there's this passage where, at one point, ignorance says to wisdom, "You're irrelevant. Look at the world. Nobody wants to pay attention to you. Where's anybody wise? Nobody's showing up for wisdom." And then and then wisdom responds and says something like wisdom says something like, "You're the cause of all suffering." Actually, really, if people understand, they want you. And besides that, you're based on an illusion. I'm based on reality. You're not even real. And then they start having this debate, and it's quite beautiful text. But my point is that we have to do that within ourselves. Does that make sense? And so part of that is, I just want to say this, is like, there are going to be times, right, where you're caught up in some mental affliction or discouragement or whatever it is for you. I think you have to actually disidentify, just like Dharmaraja did in the moment where he said, "I'm not you." Mm-hmm. You have to disidentify a little bit and say, well, that's a pattern. That's not me. Actually, your nature is Buddha nature. Your deepest nature is your Buddha nature. So you have to disidentify from that. And then you have to kind of look at it, right? And you have to kind of talk to it. And sometimes, in Tibetan Buddhism, you look around this room, right? There are all these different, like there are blue Buddhas, and there are male Buddhas and female Buddhas, and it's quite beautiful. That's one beautiful aspect of the Tibetan tradition, artwork, but also this beautiful, varied archetypal iconography. And in a way, I think part of that would be, you also find, part of it is you could walk around this room sometime and just say, which image resonates with me? Which one do I feel? And then say, Dharmaraja, it was a red Yamantaka. For you, it might be, white Tara, or red Amitayas, or blue Medicine Buddha. They're all here. These are some examples. Mm-hmm. And then you can kind of imagine your own version of that, like saying, okay, well, so I have this potential for wisdom, like white Tara. She's also a wisdom deity. And I have this discouragement. White Tara doesn't get discouraged. But anyway, and then you have to kind of see, like, all right, so that's not me. Then how do I work with that? How do I overcome that? How do I transform that? And that you have to kind of develop your own inner wisdom so that when you're stuck in something, you know what to tell yourself. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And how to talk to yourself with wisdom like a good friend. And that psychologist in Texas, researcher, she often said, like Kristen Neff, who researched self-compassion, she once said at this point, she said, talk to yourself, tell yourself what you would tell somebody you love. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'll just make a side point about this. Think just for a moment, right now, I'm not going to actually say it out loud, but think for a moment about the worst thing you've ever said to yourself in your own mind. Like when you're alone. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then ask yourself, would I say that to somebody I love? Hopefully not. Or would you want to? Your best friend. And I'll make this point, part of self-compassion is if you wouldn't say something to somebody you care about, if you wouldn't want to say it to your best friend or your child, don't say it to yourself. And replace it at the minimum with what you would say to somebody you deeply care about. If you want to even do better than that, you could ask yourself, well, what would Lama Tsongkhapa tell you? What would White Tara tell you? What would the Buddha tell you? You know, whatever, like, that's self-compassion, right? You replace this sort of either self-neglect, where you're doing hurtful things, you don't even notice it, you don't pay attention, right? Or even self-cruelty, where you put yourself down, then you just say, if I wouldn't do that to somebody I love, I won't do it to myself. If you ever catch yourself saying something to yourself you wouldn't say to somebody you love, I would just say, stop yourself. And say, that's cruel. And actually, if you keep saying it to yourself, you're someday going to say it. You will say it to somebody else implicitly, maybe verbally or maybe implicitly, but it'll be the people closest to you. You know, you won't say it to somebody who's a stranger. You'll say it to when you're really stressed out, you'll say it to your child, your grandchild, your spouse. That's where it comes out. You know, so if you stop saying it to yourself, you'll stop saying it to others. Does that make sense? And start replacing it with these kinds of messages. And then I want to, this time. So I want to conclude with a point, going back to Lama Tsongkhapa's text about joyous effort. He talks about rely on 4 favorable conditions for joyous effort. And this is how he concludes his chapter, the section on joyous effort. And I want to share these with you. So he says this is like a summary of how do you develop joyous effort. And so he starts with, he says, I'll read his quote and then I'll explain it. He says, the power of devotion, or faith, you could say devotion, is to meditate on causes and effects so as to aspire to discard and adopt. So that one is, right, the power of to meditate on. So what he's saying there is you have to keep reminding yourself of what? You have to advertise to yourself, right? That's what I was saying earlier, right? Like, so you have to keep saying to yourself, well, what are the disadvantages and the advantages, right, of this? And it's the same thing people do, again, because why do people do what they do? They see huge advantages to it, right? And if you start to see the disadvantages, then you stop doing something. If you really integrate, you know, and part of it is we don't always think deeply enough about them or repent. You know, I don't think that, like, that's what propaganda is, isn't it, too? I mean, it's repetition. You know, propaganda is doing that with falsehoods, right? And actually, like, you know, people kill each other over it. Like, people come, you know, like, actually, if you said, I mean, oh my goodness, it's so, I mean, if you actually step back, like, war, right? When every country, when they're building up to war, they do propaganda, right? And they say, like, I just saw, like, where people, especially, like, I was going to say, like, what's there to say, right? Anyway, I won't go into detail, but the point is like, where, like, whoever a country's gone to, they say, oh, those people are, and then they usually have slurs, right? And then they kind of start to view them as less than human, right? And at first glance, of course, it's idiotic. What a stupid thing. Like, it's just totally inane, right? The idea that anybody's less than human. And of course, we're so stupid because then we become, you know, if you step back, of course, we become allies then with those people, and then we want to work with them to kill somebody else. And suddenly the ones we hate, right? I mean, like, if you read, like, descriptions of the United States, descriptions of, you know, even of, like, British soldiers, right? Then, of course, the British soldiers were our allies, and then we hated the Germans, and then the Germans are our allies, but we hate, you know, people in somewhere else, and then it's like totally insane, right? So, and all that is just repetition. So you can believe the stupidest things in the world through repetition. So here, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, well, if you can believe idiotic, unbelievably stupid things to the point where you'll give your life for something stupid, right? Like the idea that somebody, just because you said they're less than human, you'll actually go kill them and risk your own life to do it. He's saying, well, then if you repeat to yourself something realistic and healthy, that'll work too, and it's a lot better idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So he's saying, meditate on it over and over again. Because if you don't, what's the word, like, you know, you'll fall, if you don't teach yourself over and over again what's true, then you'll fall for somebody else's lie. That's part of the point.
Yeah.
But it takes repetition. So that's his first. He says, you have to repeat that over and over. He says, right, repeat over and over so that you'll aspire to discard what causes you and others misery, and will adopt what causes you and others happiness. But if you don't think about it over and over again, people are going to tell you all kinds of nonsense, actually. They do. You know, like, it's, I mean, whether it's your culture, whether it's politicians, whether it's your friends, people say all kinds of nonsense, so you have to keep telling yourself what's true, and repeating it, and thinking, and then you'll develop an aspiration, right? That's what he says, aspire. Then the power of stability, and this one's quite important, actually. He says, the power of stability, this is number 2 of 4. So he says, the power of stability is not to engage in anything haphazardly without investigating it, and having investigated, to engage in it and bring it to completion. And what he's saying there is this, is actually the Buddhism says this too, like, and other teachings also say this, is there's a kind of karmic habit, a bad karmic habit, according to Buddhism. If you like start something and then you don't finish it, then you start something else, you don't finish it, then you start something else, you don't finish it. It's not a good habit to get into. And it can create a habit that then goes into even future lives, they say. And it's like, you never bring anything to completion then. And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, he says, think deeply, right? Think deeply about what you're going to commit to doing. And if you're not sure it's worthwhile, don't bother. You know, and even if everybody else is telling you something's worthwhile, if you're not sure it's worthwhile, don't bother doing it. And then he says, when you recognize something through your own investigation is meaningful, then commit to it and don't stop until you finish. And there's a point there, which is if it's a compassionate, meaningful thing, there are going to be difficulties. There are going to be obstacles. Because that's true for everything, right? Like, I mean, people who are trying to just get an education or build a business, they face all kinds of obstacles. Of course you're going to face obstacles. That's normal. But he's saying, so think deeply, don't start unless you want to do it, and if you commit to it, then finish it. And I'll make one more sub-point to that, which again relates in a way back to boundaries, is
Excuse me, this was the power of
stability, second
Thank
one.
You're here.
And part of the point with this one is, also people sometimes take on too big of projects from the beginning, and then they can't bring them to completion. And part of the implication here is, you know, if you know something's meaningful, maybe you can, I mean, one way to do it is to start with something small that you can bring to completion. Then bring something else small to completion. Then something else small. Eventually you can maybe do bigger things, right? But if you start with something that's too big for you, and then you don't bring it to completion, that undermines your sense of confidence, and it gets in the way. So, you know, very brave bodhisattvas take on humongous projects. But we have to start with smaller ones and build up, you know. I was thinking about that with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, where he said, I'll feed all the monks at Sarajay Monastery until the end of time, or something. That was like, and he's done it, you know. Now he's raised all the money, and he gave them a foundation, like what's the word, endowment, and he took it to completion. But not all of us can start with something like that, right? Like to feed about a few thousand people every day forever. So we have to maybe start with feed one person, you know, or make one meal. You know, you can start small and build up. That's the point. But that's the power of stability. Then the power of joy, and this is quite beautiful. This one. So I'll read this line. It's short but beautiful. He says, "The power of joy makes your undertaking of joyous effort uninterrupted and insatiable, like a child at play." And this is quite a meaning, right? So that's the power of joy. And what he's getting at there is what we've been talking about in a way all day, right? Which is, if you want to have a Dharma practice that works, it should be like that. It should be as fun as a child at play. Actually, my old friend who's taught at the center, I think, Paula Chichester. Hasn't she
Oh,
taught here?
yes,
She's my old friend.
here.
She's an old friend of mine. And one time she was saying she was actually making this point, but she made me laugh. She was a nun. Now she's not a nun. This is probably a sign she wasn't going to stay a nun. But she was a nun at the time, and she was talking to me, and she said like, she was a nun. She said, like, you know, like when you were a teenager and you fell in love and you would like stay up all night with your lover. She said, it's like that. She probably won't stay a nun. But I'm joking. But that, like a child at play, like where you're in love with what you're doing, where you're like, it's insatiable, right? That's like when you say to the child, you know, you have to come in from outside, and they're like, oh, can I have 5 more minutes? Oh, it's so fun. You know, like they're having, like to feel like that about your practice. And that means you have to find the practices that you love, right? And everybody's different, you know, but that's why at the beginning, where we said one of the 3 things was, what do you already love? So you have to start with those, and like do the practices you love doing, you know, and then you slowly learn to love other practices, or you find other practices you love. And then your practice becomes fun, right? And it's like the most fun thing, you know, and that's a good sign, isn't it? That's a sign, because that's the sign that that person will continually practice, right? And will, like, their practice will infuse their life, you know. And it shouldn't be, that's what I started with, right? It shouldn't feel like some duty. It should feel like, and if it's becoming a duty, it means either like you're approaching it the wrong way or you're doing something wrong. It should be, that's what Dharma practice is, right? It should feel like play. Does that make sense? So if you do a meditation practice, like if you're doing it right, it should be like, I can't wait till I get to that part. You know, I get to do that. You know, oh, how fun! I get to go meditate now. You know, and if you're doing other practices, like somebody set up those water bowls or making offerings or whatever it is, like, and one point is like, if This really helped me one time. I'll just share it. It's on that point. Then I'll get to the last one. One day, Gyume Khenso-rinpoche, my teacher, I was doing a retreat at the time, and he gave me this advice. He said, so I was like doing a retreat. So I was like, and I was trying to be very like structured. I like doing a retreat, but then I was being very structured. I was like, okay, I'm gonna do a long session, and I'm gonna do this session and that session. And then he said, you know, if you're not having fun, stop the session. Go do something else and come back to it. And I was like, well, now, like I was like, well, he said to do it, okay. So I started a session, and it was very fun. It was actually interesting. I started this one session. Soon after he said that, I started a session. I was like, my mind just didn't want to be there. It was like wanting to be somewhere else. And I was like, well, my mind doesn't want to be here. I'm done. And I just stopped. And like from that point forward, this retreat became so fun. It was like, became so much, like then I was like, well now I was doing sessions that were much longer sometimes than before, and then sometimes shorter, but it was like I was going with what was working and what felt energizing, and it was like, it was much better retreat, you know, so whether it's your daily practice or you're doing a little retreat or whatever it is, that's the power of joyous effort, right? Is to find those practices that bring you joy and to emphasize those, and then to find other things and keep building on that until it becomes a joy that fills your whole life. And then the last of these 4 favorable conditions for joyous effort, here they translate the power of suspension. I think better to say the rest, the power of rest. And and I love this, that here's Lama Tsongkhapa saying this to us. He's saying, I'll read the line, then I'll comment just like I did before. So he says, the power of suspension is to rest when your body and your mind are worn out due to your joyous effort. And as soon as you've recovered, you can start again. And so what he's getting at there, right, is like knowing when to take a break, knowing when to rest. And some of us aren't good at that one, right? We don't know. And he's saying, and actually it's interesting, isn't it, that part of the practice of effort is rest. Because that's where this comes in, right? It's not in a different section. Which wouldn't, again, you wouldn't necessarily think that. You would think, no, effort is effort. I'm leaving out the joyous for a second on purpose, but, you know, effort is effort. But part of what he's saying is, no, effort is also rest, right? Is knowing when to rest. And that, again, that we have to, it implies in a way, doesn't it, that we have to know ourselves. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to check in. You have to actually check in with yourself, right? You have to pause and check how, because he says your body and your mind, right? So you have to pause and check, how is my body? How is my mind? And how often do you guys do that? I mean, everybody's different, but how often do you pause and actually ask yourself, what's the state of my body? What's the state of my mind? What does my body and mind need? Does it need rest now, or is it ready for effort again? And that's what he's saying, is you have to check in, know when the time is to rest, go responsibly, take responsibility and care of yourself, which is, we could call this self-care in English, right? People don't talk about, I mean, I don't know if those guys use that term, but that's actually similar, right, to what we talked about, you know, is self-care, right? Taking care of your body and your mind so that you have energy to keep going in an energetic, fun way. Fun, that's funny. Fun, that's the word. Play, fun, joy. Okay. Any questions about that? Was that pretty clear? I wanted to conclude with those 4 points because I think they're quite beautiful from them.
Yeah, yeah.
But any questions about those? They're pretty clear. Or... Yeah. Well then, we just have 2 minutes left, so let's do this as a kind of conclusion. You know, I'll do this. Okay, so in Buddhist practice, actually, Khenso-rinpoche once said this. He said, if you start something with a good motivation. So we started this morning with compassion. You know, a motivation of compassion. Right? So that's a good motivation. And then we made an effort together to do something positive, to think about these positive topics. And so they say that's like you could call that, sometimes they call it merit or good karma or positive potential or positive energy, however you want to call it. So that's the proper way, right? You start with a good motivation. In other words, if you don't start with a good motivation, it's not really positive, you know. But if your motivation is good and then your action is good, then it's good. And then Khenso-rinpoche said, he gave this metaphor to me one time. He said, so that's like creating gold. And he said, but then you have to dedicate the merit to something with your mind. And he said, because otherwise, instead of a golden Buddha statue, you could end up with a golden toilet. He said, the gold will become something. And he said, but it could become just a golden toilet. That was very funny. He said, but better if it becomes a golden Buddha statue. A golden toilet's not really needed. That's kind of gross. So anyway, the idea is you dedicate the merit so it'll become something beautiful. So we created that positive energy and karma today, so let's dedicate it.
Thank you.
And so if we dedicate it, let's dedicate it with compassion also. So we can dedicate something, you know, maybe you can say your own, but I'll just say something in your mind, but I'll just give an example. Like, so we started with compassion, so let's end with compassion. So through this positive potential, this positive energy, this merit, first of all, may everyone here actually, you know, each day gradually make progress in actually overcoming the causes of suffering in ourselves, in our own minds and bodies, particularly our minds, our lives. Like uproot the superficial and then the deep and then the even deepest causes of suffering in our hearts. And thereby, you know, may we be able to live more and more in this life and all future lives of overwhelming love, overwhelming compassion, bodhicitta, and deep wisdom. And that way may we go from joy to joy, you know, living the life, like the life approach of a bodhisattva, which is like a life of compassion and love with overwhelming joy, you know, that's also of service to ourselves and of service to others. And by living in that way, may we be able to, first of all, not harm others, and then bring help to others. May we actually, you know, through our body, our speech, and our minds, may we share love and compassion with others. May we help others to gain wisdom and to uproot the superficial, the deep, and the very deepest causes of suffering in themselves, helping them to also find a path of love, compassion, joy, and wisdom. Ultimately, may we become fully enlightened Buddhas, enlightened beings for the welfare of others. And may we lead all others to their own highest achievement, to the full achievement of love, compassion, wisdom, skill, joy. Thanks very much.